Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a really complex, honestly fascinating legal analysis drawn straight from our source documents. We're looking at a detailed assessment of Dr. Chen Jingyuan's blood letter from prison. What's so wild about this document is that it isn't your everyday standard legal defense. Nope, it's a text that essentially puts the entire Kunming judicial system itself on trial. We're going to break down how legal experts and analytical models evaluate these massive allegations against the very framework that's supposed to uphold justice. We'll be looking at this objectively across multiple legal dimensions, totally impartially, and just following the legal logic wherever it leads us. To do that effectively, we have a 5-part agenda today. 1. Core accusations. 2. Criminal and procedural analysis. 3. Constitutional rights. 4. The mirror test. And 5. Systemic risks. Let's just get right into it. Part 1, the core overview of accusations. Let's set the stage here and establish the core premise of our explainer. According to the case file, Dr. Chan isn't merely pleading not guilty. He's actively pointing the finger directly at law enforcement and judicial officers, specifically naming names and claiming there are systemic, structural violations going on. He's arguing the process itself was weaponized. I mean, just listen to the sheer weight of this alleged quote. The documents claim that prosecutor Ji Bin actually made this shocking statement during the trial, did not verify the facts, and do not plan to. If that's true, that's a massive, massive red flag when it comes to legal obligations. Think about it. A prosecutor openly admitting to ignoring the burden of proof, that points straight to potential dereliction of duty, or at the very least, bending the law for personal gain. And this totally shifts our focus, right? We're no longer just looking at a simple defense strategy. We're looking at a harsh critique of the judicial process itself. The claims here include a closed trial, restricted defense, and a guilty until proven innocent mindset. If accurate, these directly violate Articles 11, 12, 33, and 187 of the Criminal Procedure Law. It really paints this grim picture of a process where the verdict was allegedly baked in way before any evidence was even looked at. Moving on to Section 2, Criminal and Procedural Analysis. Let's take a look at how the main criminal charge against the defendant actually holds up under a strict legal lens. The crucial thing here is comparing the incredibly strict legal requirements for the charge of picking quarrels and provoking trouble against what actually happened in reality. Article 293 demands 3 very specific things. You have to spread verifiably false information, do it with explicit intent, and cause severe disruption to public order. But the source documents argue that the reality of this case just doesn't match up. The shared content was allegedly art, historical opinions, and emotional venting. You can't exactly prove those true or false, you know? Intent was basically just assumed based on the defendant's education level, and there was zero proof of any actual social chaos or mass disruption.
Plus, when you map out the timeline of these allegations, it creates a deeply troubling sequence. Step 1, an arrest with no proper warrant or family notification. Step 2, extracting evidence through what's described as prolonged interrogation and coercion. And Step 3, a closed-door conviction. If this sequence is verified, it is a total inversion of due process. It's that infamous arrest first, find evidence later playbook, which is entirely detached from actual legal norms.
That brings us to Section 3, Constitutional and Human Rights. Let's elevate this from just procedural flaws and look at it through the lens of supreme domestic law and international human rights standards. Because criminalizing academic or emotional posts online isn't just a procedural hiccup, it strikes at the absolute core of fundamental constitutional rights. We're talking about Article 35 for freedom of speech, Article 37 for personal liberty, and Article 38 for human dignity. It also brushes right up against international agreements like the ICCPR on arbitrary detention and fair trials. The core argument here is that the state is wildly overstepping its constitutional limits by trying to regulate a person's thoughts and basic expressions as if they were physical crimes. And this is a perfect illustration of what legal scholars call the proportionality principle. The idea is that criminal law has to be the ultima ratio, the absolute unequivocal last resort. Using the heavy hammer of a criminal sanction just for forwarding some online opinions is presented in these documents as a massive overreach. It contradicts the very foundation of constitutional justice, essentially flipping a system meant to protect citizens into one that just suppresses them. So this brings us to a really fascinating turning point in the explainer. Based on the defendant's own arguments, we kind of have to ask a deeply philosophical question. If the system behaves like this, who is really the one picking quarrels? Let's look at Section 4, the mirror test critique, we're going to unpack the intellectual climax of this whole assessment, which uses this brilliant concept from jurisprudence called reductio ad absurdum, basically taking the prosecution's logic to its most absurd conclusion to prove it wrong.
The defense introduces something called the mirror test, or a normative consistency test. It's such a cool analytical tool. Basically, the test asks this. If we take the prosecution's own extremely loose, stretched-out definition of a crime and apply those exact same standards to the alleged conduct of the judicial officers themselves, what happens? Well, the results are pretty striking. Just look at the contrast when you place these behaviors side by side. On one hand, you have the defendant, who shared some online posts with absolutely no proven real-world harm. On the other hand, you have the system itself, who's allegedly fabricating legal documents, ignoring evidence, and holding closed trials. The argument is that if fabricating information to cause social disruption is the actual standard for this crime, then ironically, a judicial system manufacturing a false conviction and destroying public trust fits that definition way better than the accused citizen ever did. It is a devastatingly logical reversal.
Finally, Section 5, Systemic Risks and Conclusions. Let's zoom out a bit. Moving past the specific legal gymnastics of the mirror test, we need to look at the broader implications here for the rule of law and political ethics. What is super fascinating here is this dual framework operating in the background. You really have to understand the status of judicial officers who are also party members. An ordinary citizen is only bound by national law, right? But a party member judicial officer operates under a strict dual obligation. If they abuse the law, fabricate evidence, or extract confessions through coercion, they aren't just breaking national criminal codes, they're severely violating core political and organizational party discipline. They're actively betraying the fundamental policy of ruling the country by law. When you look at this comprehensive matrix, it perfectly sums up the multi-dimensional assessment. It shows that if Dr. Chen's documented claims are accurate, this case basically fails on virtually every single level. Criminally, it's missing the severe disruption element. Procedurally, it's allegedly full of violations. Constitutionally, it infringes on fundamental rights. And ethically, it totally violates party discipline. It is a complete structural collapse of legal justification. So, we're going to leave you with this final provocative thought based on this deep dive. This extensive analysis really forces us to ask a critical question about the very nature of justice itself. Does true rule of law use order as a tool to suppress freedom, or does it use due process as an unbreakable shield to protect human dignity? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning the frameworks around you.